I'm going to start in a moment. I'd like to welcome all of you to our event, which is co-sponsored by the Tocqueville program, the Ostrom Workshop, and the Department of Political Science at Indiana University. I'm Aurelian Craiuțu. I direct this program, small program actually, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome today Francesca Lidia Viano, who is joining us from Turin, Italy. Francesca is a fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Studies. She has written extensively on intellectual exchanges between Europe and the United States. And I came to know Francesca's work through her book, Sentinel, The Unlikely History of the Statue of Liberty, published by Harvard University Press in 2018. This is a book that traces the hidden and often controversial story of the ideas, people, encounters, and misunderstanding behind the statue that is the emblem of liberty in America. And it is a book that reads wonderfully, written in short chapters and weaving personal biography with history of ideas. And since I've always been very interested in the work of the person behind the Statue of Liberty, Edouard Laboulaye, I found the book extremely interesting. Francesca is working on a new book project called The Union Man, Trust and the Making of America. And this explores the intellectual, emotional, and political dynamics leading to the Revolutionary War and its constitutional aftermath. Today's topic that will occupy our attention is entitled, What Says the Goddess, Miss Liberty, and the Sorrows of the Abstract Icon. I should add, before I let Francesca speak, I should add that this is the second lecture in a series that we'll be hosting during the academic year, entitled The Idea of America. We want to rediscover some of the key moments in American intellectual history and political history, and this lecture is the second after last week's lecture on Alexander Hamilton's political writings. So I'd like to pass the baton to Francesca. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Viano, who will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take question and answers. So the floor is yours, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Aurelian. I am deeply honored to be here this afternoon, and particularly honored to give a talk in such a crucial moment, because I am a European, superstitious Southern European. I am keeping my champagne in the fridge, but I will abstain from celebrating. And I hope that, if I can say that, next week the speaker will formally start the post-Trumpian phase of this seminar. But I won't say anything. Right now we are in a limbo, and I think if there is something we know about this limbo now, that Americans are deeply divided. So why don't we bring into our conversation virtually, of course, Colin Woodard, the author of a recently published book, Union, the Battle for the Story of United States Nationhood, where it is claimed that the idea that Americans have a common past going back to colonial times is a myth. So there is not a single America, but a variety of Americans with different histories and values. So if this idea helps us understanding what's happening in these elections, it also helps us understand the topic we have this afternoon, which is the Statue of Liberty. Well, particularly in these days, the Statue of Liberty speaks different languages to different people. This is not weighing well on her. If we listen to a recent cartoon published in the New Yorker, where we see the statue laying on the analyst's bed, the analyst being an American eagle with glasses and ties, and saying that although she's a beacon of light, she feels like the corroded hologram of an America that never existed. So my question this afternoon is, was the Statue of Liberty ever the icon of America? Well, she certainly was so at the beginning of her life, but not because her architect, Frederick August Bartholdi, wanted her to be so. Bartholdi did not care at all for America when he started building the Statue of Liberty. And indeed, the first project for the Statue of Liberty were meant to go somewhere else. They were meant to go to Egypt. Bartholdi thought of placing an anthropomorphic colossal statue at the Red Sea entrance of the Suez Canal, which the French had just finished building. And the statue looked really similar to our statue today. She was more erotic, she had a different position, but her outstretched right arm held a burner. In another version, you can really see either a lantern or a torch. And in her left hand, she held a piece of broken vase, the Roman symbol of liberty. At night, beams of light were supposed to emanate from a crown. The man who helped Bartholdi convert this project from Egypt to America was our man, Edouard de Laboulaye, the admirer of Tocqueville, an aristocrat like Tocqueville, a descendant of a family who bore the scars of French terror, and like his family, Bartholdi, and like Tocqueville, was a Catholic, a conservative. So he despised the Rousseauian ideals leading to the Second Republic, and he was equally distrustful of monarchism. So the ideal state for him was America. He said America was a democracy that, by divine illumination, had been able to lead the way to equality without imperiling individual rights. And I would like to attract your attention on these two words, divine illumination. There were no ways for people like Tocqueville and Laboulaye to make sense of what was happening in America in the first half of the 19th century, according to the tests they were conducting in their intellectual laboratories in Europe. The only way they could explain America was recurring to the idea of a miracle. So, stretching my argument a little bit too much, maybe, but we can talk about this later, we could say that American studies in Europe, Tocqueville included, were born out of a bunch of mystic philosophers who believed that America was a miracle. And I'm going to talk about two of these characters this afternoon, quite briefly, because we don't have much time. So the first one is Pierre-Simon Ballanche. He was a theosophist from Lyon, and he wrote a book made of various volumes, still incomplete, where he describes the history of humanity as a series of painful trials, taking the form either of wars or revolutions. America was not part of this story, because he said that America was an exception. It was made of devastators, people who slaughtered the natives, brought the African people to America, and still they were able to build the most perfect example of democracy ever invented. Why? So, according to Ballanche, Americans put themselves under the protection of the God of the Christians, the God of liberty. Why was this so important? Because this God gave them a sense of solidarity and communality that normally only traditions and painful trials give to peoples. And so they took a shortcut. That's it. A miraculous shortcut of America. Laboulaye condensed his thought by saying Christianity, and I'm quoting, is a religion and philosophy of liberty. So one would be tempted to just jump to the Statue of Liberty, and we could do that. But I want for you to stay with me a little bit more with another mystic interpreter of America from the 19th century, early 19th century. And this is Frederick Hauser. He was a disciple of Fichte and Schelling, who gave a mystic twist to their theories. And their mysticism came from Renaissance Neoplatonism. So in essence, he said, the world is an emanation of God. If we want to know God, we have to find and interpret the signs of his presence in this world. How do we do that? Well, the Neoplatonists said that love was a driving force, love for material beauty, which then was upgraded to love for spiritual beauty. Krause said something very similar, except that he was a Protestant and he moved the whole system from the outside world of perception to the inside world of conscience. So for him, knowledge was a gradual revelation starting from self-consciousness and leading to a gradual understanding of the whole world. But this jump to the inner self is what is going to make our statue meaningful for Americans of all generations. Krause's system, differently from the one we talked about earlier, the Renaissance Neoplatonic system, had an important political and social dimension. Krause said, once man has found God in himself, he can find God in other men and women, and therefore they will be able to build organic societies. America was the first example, the perfect example of these organic societies. The American Constitution is called Gemeindeverfassung, which means a municipal communal constitution, which brought individual rational beings together to form an organism. Well, Bartholdi will go on and say this in easier words and apply them not only to the American Constitution, but to the Declaration of Independence, which the statue holds under her left arm. He says, God has originally created all men equal. So the Declaration of Independence implies this principle that governments are tacit agreement among generally equal men pursuing the common good. So La Bollée put all these spiritual ideas together and brought them to Bartholdi. And the task of translating these ideas into a statue was not easy. He was not asking or suggesting Bartholdi to create an image of America, because precedents for that were abundant already. Just think of Thomas Crawford's Statue of Freedom on the Capitol with the eagle on her head, or think of Uncle Sam, or think of Miss Liberties from the 18th century, or think of Colombia. Here, Bartholdi had to build a spiritual monument. And we know that since medieval times, iconoclasts said that God was not representable. And of course, their fears were overcome over time, but suspicions never really went away. So much so that in the Renaissance, during the Renaissance, we found Cesare Ripa, the maximum expert in Roman and medieval images, suggesting artists to represent the soul as a woman with a veiled face, because, he said, the soul is made of invisible substance. So La Bollée was quite an iconoclast himself. He thought that artists of his time were not able to, and I'm quoting, going beyond color and form to reach higher beauty. But Bartholdi was an exception. And he was an exception because he came out of the atelier of a painter whom I don't know if you know or not. In the 19th century, he was crucially important. His name was Henri Scheffer. He was a religious painter. His works were known everywhere, in Europe, South America, North America, reproduced in thousands of prints. They circulated across among the elites everywhere. Now let's take this painting in particular, and you will see that he used a very soft palette, very soft colors, and he only used lines that were necessary to the economy of the general figure and painting. He synthesized figures. This is why he didn't want, this is because he didn't want to go too deep into the representation of nature. Nature was only a repository of images to be used to express spiritual meanings. Take this Christus Remunerator, for example, and you will see that it's a man and it's God at the same time. It's a man who has found God in himself and is gathering around himself the crowds and humanity of people suffering, loving, being weak, penitents, revolutionaries. This is the most important Kraussian monument work of art of the 19th century, before the Statue of Liberty was built. Bartholdi came out of this atelier and followed the spiritual path indicated by Schaeffer. When a commission was stolen from Bartholdi, he came out with this composition. Is a genius, of course, Bartholdi's genius, trying to emancipate himself from the claws of misery. In 1862, when the Russians repressed the Polish revolution, he sculptured this colossal Prometheus chained to a rock, devoured by a vulture. It is the allegory of the pain suffered by the revolutionaries, but more in general, it's the allegory of the pain inflicted to the soul. So Bartholdi was a sculptor of the soul in Paris, and the soul and its torments. It's a typically romantic motive, but in case of Bartholdi, has a colossal sculptural rendering. Because of course, Schaeffer had his own way of transcend nature, which was using soft colors, synthesizing lines. But what about Bartholdi? Well, Bartholdi found his solution in Egypt, where he went 2 times, first in 1854 and then in 69. The first time he went, he was only 21. He went with an older painter, Jean-Léon Gérôme, and as you can see here, in typically Orientalist spirit, they dressed up as Arabs. But Bartholdi at the time was a photographer, and he took pictures for Gérôme to transform into paintings. But some pictures, which are still present in his archives in these days, reveal that his real interest were for columns and statues, granite statues. In 1885, before sending Miss Liberty to America, Bartholdi would at length speak about Egypt to America. He would say that these granite beings triggered profound emotions in him. But why? He said, look at these beings. They are listening to the most remote past, while their eyes are fixed on an unlimited future. There is not a single sign connecting these monsters, colossi, to the present. This was a secret of colossal art. It was a medium to represent transcendence, or to use Bartholdi's words, immensity of thought, infinity, greatness of the idea, immortality. The observer feels weak and small. The emotions Bartholdi talked about were fear and awe in front of this huge colossi. And no symbols related them to a single historical phase or moment. Bartholdi also warned Americans. He said, look, the statue I'm going to send to you is going to be special. It's going to look like a sketch, but I worked to produce this sketch. And indeed, Americans would know that, and they would protest that, well, the Statue of Liberty looked like a bag of potatoes with a stick planted in the middle. And maybe they were not wrong, but the general effect was that of triggering the sensation of transcendence and immortality. We could discuss each symbol and try to understand what it means, but it would be useless. There is a way to interpret style that makes the meaning of a work of art clear. And in this case, colossal art has this immediate communication ability with the onlookers and the viewers. The meaning was very clear to contemporary as well. Victor Hugo was almost dying. He found the strength to go to the Statue of Liberty, and he was led there by Bartholdi's mother, a strong and woman much taller than him, who took him to the entrance when the statue was ready in Paris. And Bartholdi and Hugo, very small and frail, pointed his stick to the statue's head. And then 1 year later, he was dying, and he sent this little piece of paper to Bartholdi saying, form is everything for the sculpture and still is nothing. It is nothing without the spirit. It is everything with the idea. The statue is the idea. Now, is it possible that a statue representing the idea, a pure ideal of transcendence, become a national icon? Well, potentially it was possible. Elites everywhere in the Western Hemisphere talked the Kraussian language until the 1880s. They understood the nation as a person, a consciousness, to use Ernest Renan's definition of nation, not a community of language, of color, but a voluntary community, some people sharing the same decision to live in a certain place with the memory of certain history and a certain past. When the statue arrived in America, one of the sponsors, Frederick Hauser, says, okay, the statue is clear, is a lesson of divine fraternity for all to understand. But he was being overly optimistic. Of course, Emma Lazarus understood it. A poem which is often represented and interpreted as a socialist poem is a Kraussian poem. The Statue of Liberty, like Schaeffer's Christ, is opening her arms for the suffering humanity to reach her. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. Just think of Schaeffer's Christ, of all the suffering people around him, and you will understand that Lazarus is still speaking in Kraussian terms. But the America that received the Statue of Liberty was different. The America that received the Statue of Liberty was the same one that had passed the bill to almost ban the Asians, the Chinese, from America. It was the same country that was blaming the A-market explosion on wild-eyed, long-haired, atheistic wretches from Europe. It was the same America in which Theodore Roosevelt said that highest races could no longer assimilate lowest ones. In this America, racist riots were erupting everywhere. Racial prejudices were increasing as a consequence of new waves of immigration. So in this America, the Statue of Liberty could not keep a Kraussian meaning. Laboulaye never visited America, and he died in 1883. But even before then, he had said the Black was looked at with disgust and horror by Americans in the free states and in the South alike. And he, of course, thought the Latins were better. But he said Americans had a natural antipathy for the Blacks. So, of course, he moved the chains, the broken chains that the statue used to hold in the left man's, to the statue's feet and replaced them with the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the statue's chain could not be seen from the bottom, could only be seen from above, from a hot air balloon, given the technology of the times. So could the statue be understood in this proto-nativist America? Well, not according to Mark Twain, who was one of the first sponsors of the statue, but under certain conditions. He said, do we want to keep the statue as a spiritual icon? Then we have to turn it into something else, into an American Christian symbol. For example, Adam. The character, the figure with whom he already identified is Huckleberry theme, is Tom Sawyer. And he said, monuments needs to remember something we are losing. And in this industrialized world where Darwin theories are spreading everywhere, we need to keep the idea of American innocence and ingenuity. And that's why I'm suggesting to turn this statue into Adam. But of course, the process was a little bit difficult. Turn that blanket into an ulster, part the hair on one side, conceals the sex of his head with a fire helmet, and at once she's a man. Put a harp and a halo and a palm branch in the left hand to symbolize a part of what Adam did for us. Of course, this meant changing a lot, almost replacing the Statue of Liberty with something else. Of course, his suggestions was forgotten, neglected. The Statue of Liberty was forgotten too. For 30 years, she was neglected. She stayed in the dark. Her light was too weak to function as a proper lighthouse. Sailors steered away because they were sure they heard noises of chains being dragged around inside the statue's head. Of course, she was filled of European ugly ghosts. So the statue idle there, she was forgotten, but not by everybody. So first of all, the ladies were present during the formal unveiling of the statue in October 1886. They boarded a yacht, the suffragists, and they aimed for the feet of the statue where a solemn inauguration was given, but it was private. So they shouted against the organizer, as America in general, who was so bold to present a Statue of Liberty in the shape of a female, of a majestic female, when no woman was free. So they agreed on considering the Statue of Liberty the symbol not of America, not what America had attained, but the ideal toward which all righteous men and women was striving in America. And of course, it was Georgina Schuler, the descendant of the Hamilton we talked about last week, who had Emma Lazarus's verses framed at the base of the pedestal in a ceremony where nobody was present almost. And then women again in 1915 marched along Broadway with Alice Burke's yellow suffrage automobile leading the line. And then they boarded a yacht, they went to the island, and someone asked, what says the goddess? And finally, the goddess turned toward the women and said, a mysterious voice inside the head said, vote for women. So maybe Mark Twain was being excessively pessimistic. There were ways in which Americans could take possession of the statue. Immigrants, for example, they arrived from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe, from Northern Europe, and they thought the statue was some sacred image. The Italians saw the Madonna, but the Russians as well thought of some sacred character. And there was something magic and powerful about this monument that made them forget the distant past and the sorrows experienced. They raised their children to see the Madonna. So at some point in the 70s, when European immigration was decreasing, Martin Trachtenberg said, this is the end of the statue. The statue is made in an allegorical language that modern countries are no longer able to understand. Well, this is, I think, is a point in which he's getting it wrong. I think that the Statue of Liberty is a the Kraussian, the neo-Renaissance symbol of the soul. And as such is going to prosper in America, a country that was born out of the belief in the power of what Charles Taylor would call the inner self, the power of conscience. But how? How would she prosper and live? Because of course, her connection with minorities made a stupendous instrument of propaganda out of her. And Woodrow Wilson discovered it on December 3rd, 1916, when he said, when he bathed the statue in light, he gave her light again after 30 years of darkness. Ruth Law circled the sky while he was giving his speech, and And he said the statue is finally the symbol of the American melting pot. But melting pot for Woodrow Wilson and for subsequent presidents was the assimilative machine of the United States, breaking communities and making Southern European, Eastern Europeans in particular, more Anglo-Saxon. So when the Statue of Liberty finally became a unifying national symbol, she was a symbol of white Anglo-Saxon America. No surprise then that other minorities got frustrated. First of all, Southern Europeans. Now I'm disillusioned. Perhaps I will be deported after anarchists and Bolsheviks have been deported from America. But particularly Latinos and Black and African Americans. A young protester, a young Black protester recently said, I'm tempted to break the legs of that young lady and turn her toward Mississippi. Of course, he didn't know that Batoli at some point wanted to put her on the Mississippi, but this is another story. And what Martin Luther King Jr. said about the statue could be about America in general, could be repeated for the statue. America has been the mother of its white exile from Europe. She has not evinced the same maternal care concern for Black exiles who were brought to this country in chains from Africa. So the Statue of Liberty finds herself to embody the soul, yes, the soul, but the soul of either different groups and minorities or white America. I'm not surprised when Ken Cuccinelli suggests to change Emma Lazarus's verses at the base of the Statue of Liberty, saying that Americans only want immigrants who can stand on their 2 feet, is a step forward in a direction that Woodrow Wilson started when he bathed the statue in light. It's nothing different from that. The Statue of Liberty either embodies the identities of minorities who see their struggle in her when she was originally meant as an icon of harmony, or she embodies a nativist America of assimilationists or Ken Cuccinelli. So I think the best way to conclude this story is to go back to Mark Twain. Mark Twain was very suspicious about the fact that Europeans gave Americans the Statue of Liberty and portrayed her as a young lady. He said, why is she a young lady? After years and years of begging in Europe, she's coming to America where we are giving her a home. If she's anything, she's an old beggar. If she is haughty and healthy and young, this is suspicious. Either she is calling all other beggars to come to America, or most possibly giving the arrogance of prosperity, she's going to send everybody away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you could stop sharing the
Yes.
screen. Yes, I will be able to see. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And it's such a good timing, I should say. Not that we planned for it, but it's really a wonderful coincidence. In a way, it gives us a renewed confidence in the mission and the idea of America, which is the subject of our series. What I would like to do is to invite people to raise their hands by clicking on the reaction button, and I will be inviting people in the order of the questions that I received. To give our friends a chance to think about the question, I'd like to start with a few comments on your history, Francesca. It seems to me that there are so many symbols associated with the Statue of Liberty, and in the book, in the first part of the book, I should say, you explain them in detail. There is a set of symbols that are worth mentioning again, which is the torch, the flame, the book, and the star on her head. These are all Masonic symbols, as you say in the book, and I would like to invite you to say a few things about them. You mentioned that the statue is half man and half woman, which is very interesting. I've always been in addition to the colossal size of the statue, I've always been kind of frightened by the look of the statue. I've been there once or twice, I think, but I've always had a sense of how should I put it, Deus absconditus almost. There is a kind of a god hidden behind the statue, or something indeed of Egyptian proportions. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about this androgynous nature. And thirdly, you mentioned the age of the statue, which is an interesting question. What is the age of the statue? I mean, what does it mean? What does it mean for the future of liberty in America, its civilizing mission? And final point is the direction of the statue. You mentioned in the book that is directed towards the southeast. I wonder whether there were debates on the direction of the statue. It's an interesting southeastern, orientation that I've never been able to make much sense of it. Every time I used to drive from Princeton to the JFK, I would see it as I was trying to cross the Verrazzano Bridge, and she would look at me, but I could never figure out what's the direction. So these are a few thoughts as people can raise their hand, and I will let them. I will invite them to speak. So feel free to comment on anything of this. Thank you again.
Thank you. Should I answer now?
Yeah, and then I don't see anyone yet with questions, but I will try to keep a hold of it.
So first of all, the Masonic symbols. Well, part of it is comes from the mystic atmosphere I talked about earlier. So this Balanche said that mystic initiations constellated the evolution of European countries. As you know, as Lynn Hunt has demonstrated, Masonic metaphors are very popular during the Enlightenment, and they survive throughout the 19th century. Laboulaye was a Freemason himself, and so certainly that counted as well. For what concerns sex and age, well, when I wrote the book, I don't think I was paying enough attention to the style and dimension of the statue. I think that part of the process of transcending from nature and to create an abstract icon required keeping a sex and age undeterminate. So the statue, it's very difficult to find the age and sex of Egyptian statues as well.
Yeah.
As Bartholdi said, they are sketches. But there is a second explanation, which I used in the book, and I think is still valid. And this has to do with the fact that mystic theories in the 19th century praised the anthropomorphic ideal. I'm thinking about Saint-Simon and Enfantin and all his followers had this idea of conjugating the feminine and the masculine. And this, of course, was also important in interpreting progress and the conjunction of the East and the West, because the East, according to Saint-Simon and Enfantin, was represented by the feminine aspects of fertility and industriosity and enthusiasm, therefore the fire, while the masculine part was the sun and the knowledge and all these stereotypes that endure through time, but were important for the making of the statue. As for the direction, what I suggested in the book was that the statue was turned toward countries that France thought of dominating in the centuries to come. It was also turned in the direction of England, which is important because Laboulaye was a neo-colonialist with a strong antipathy towards Britain. So one of the reasons the statue was there was to remember that the French were there in America before the British came. And that was a nationalist point, because in this conversation, we stressed how much Americans changed their way of thinking about nations and nationalism in the transition from the 19th to the 20th century. But of course, Europeans as well were changing that view. And Laboulaye was transitioning from a Kraussian ideal to a more nationalistic and aggressive vision of what France had to be in the world. I think that was the reason.
Before I give the floor to Stefan Kolev, who is joining us from Leipzig in Germany, to ask a question, I'd like to read, to remind all of you what Francis Lieber, what Laboulaye wrote in a letter to Francis Lieber. He said, if the first article of faith of any Frenchman is to love France, the second is to love America. This was from 1860s. It's a beautiful line that I always like to quote. Dr. Kolev, you are next.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I was particularly intrigued by Woodrow Wilson, how he came into the picture during World War I, and by your saying that basically the statue became the symbol of that America that has to be homogenized and where minorities basically have to be made Anglo-Saxon. Could you tell us more about that? This was really, really interesting.
Sorry, I lost you a little bit.
So you said that Wilson tried to make the statue basically a symbol of the homogenization of America, making it Anglo-Saxon. Can you tell more about that? I think it's extremely interesting because it's really contradictory to the way we usually think of it as the minority welcoming.
Well, yes, I think is well, I came to believe that that it was purely instrumental, particularly in the light of what Wilson, of Wilson's policies. But I think that the counterintuitive part is exactly that. So the Statue of Liberty got so intertwined with the life of discontented minorities that it became precious as a propaganda instrument, and is as an instrument of propaganda. Wilson was particularly sincerely grateful for certain contribution by Irish immigrants, also for family reasons, right? But I think that the act of lighting it was particularly important. We did not talk about the contest, which was World War I. And of course, Americans when the statue was bathed in light, Americans had not intervened formally yet, but they were about to. And so the statue was important as a European manufact, reflecting American liberty. So it was perfect. It was European, but it was a European recognition of American superiority, just perfect for World War I. I guess, but the melting pot idea was also there, and it would continue to prosper and become more and more important. If you think President Johnson signing the Immigration Act at the feet of the Statue of Liberty, right, and on Ronald Reagan turning the Statue of Liberty into an icon of emerging libertarianism, the new way of freedom, economic freedom, but also connecting her to the ideal of good ethics and hard work brought by particularly German immigrants, Northern European immigrants. So it's counterintuitive, but I think the idea that the Statue of Liberty becomes a white icon the moment it's used as the symbol of the melting pot is quite interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The queue is open. I just want to remind you, you can either send a note in chat or raise your hand by clicking the reactions button. As we are waiting for any other possible question, I'd like to add one more comment, Francesca. So people can reflect on this. It took in the book you identify as the beginning of the project a dinner that took place in Glatigny, which was the residence of Laboulaye, soon after the conclusion of the Civil War in America, 1865, where Bartholdi was one of the participants. Would you like to say a little bit more about that, and as well as why it took so long, 1865, 1886, to complete this project? Laboulaye passes away in 1883. I know that there were problems with money for a few years, and it took them a long time to complete this. Originally, it was supposed to celebrate the centenary of the American independence in 1786.
This is what Bartholdi tells us, and there is a little bit of a mystery there, because all the papers relating to those years, 1865, 1869, are gone. The only testimony of that episode, which is told and retold by everybody, from the museum in New York to books everywhere, is that the statue was born out of this meeting. There is no way to prove that this meeting ever took place. Bartholdi and Laboulaye got together by the late 50s because Bartholdi's brother was schizophrenic. And so Laboulaye needed to help Bartholdi in a way or the other. Bartholdi, we know that in 1865, Bartholdi sculptured a bust for Laboulaye, who was a liberal candidate at the time at Strasbourg. But this is all we know. The first indication that the two were collaborating on a project came when Bartholdi is still busy making the Egyptian maquette in 1869. And then one of the first letters I found after this gap says is Bartholdi talking to his mother, says, "I know you're angry, and I know you don't believe that the same monument can be applied to two different hemispheres. The same principle can be applied to two different hemispheres," which is incredibly interesting. So it is possible that this dinner took place and that Bartholdi took into consideration the idea of building something for America. At the moment, he was busy in Egypt, and he thought of using the same idea to build the statue of progress in Egypt. The name of the Egyptian project was Progress in Lighting Asia. But it's a soul, again, I mean, it's an image of the soul awaking, of the conscience awaking to God in any context you want to put her. So it's possible that they talked about the American idea, then they first applied it to Egypt and they went back to America. Or he could have created a Saint-Simonian icon right away for Egypt, because the fire for the Saint-Simonians was a symbol of industry, enthusiasm, fertility. And then Laboulaye noticed that it could easily be translated to America. It's impossible to say, but what made the process so slow was, first of all, the indecision. Bartholdi really wanted to put the statue in Egypt, but there was no money for the project. And then the war, the Franco-Prussian War, which stopped everything. Then the journey to America, because Laboulaye just put Bartholdi in touch with some Americans. Laboulaye never went to America himself. So it was a long process. Americans to warm up to a project they did not understand, they did not want. And then when things got started around 1875, there was no money to proceed. And the project was complicated because, of course, it had to involve French businesses in America. So the copper, for example, was produced by French mines in Michigan. So the places where in northern Michigan. So in places we used to be French before the 7 Years' War. It was a very complicated project, and the business side of this project revealed the anti-British sentiment that inspired this monument. So today we talked about the aesthetics and the symbolism and the meaning for America, but the European side of the story is fragmented in a series of communities of dialogue which interacted among each other and made the story incredibly complicated.
That's fascinating. Dean Luck is next. Thank you.
Dean Luke, actually.
I always mispronounce your last name because
you keep doing that.
it has a German connotation. Yeah. Okay.
Nice to see you from Turin. I spent a sabbatical there and have many friends there. So my question, and I'm an economist, is it seems like one could tell a story about lots of colossal statues or monuments all over the world in which there are there are promoters, there are critics, and those promoters and critics change over time. These are in public spaces, and so we get conflict at some points. The conflict may subside, and it's a it's a theme that's popping up in the U.S. In different settings recently as well, and probably in Europe and other places also, where some group or set of interests gets a monument put somewhere. It's all good in their view, but it's not good for everybody. It's in a public space. I wonder, what are there implications for this study in thinking about the role of these public monuments, these public statues, and so on that you've drawn from your work?
Well, no, I did not deal with that aspect in particular, but I am still surprised the Statue of Liberty is standing where it was originally put, because, as I said, she alienated many groups, and for correct reasons. I mean, I don't think one should throw her away. But for example, the fact that she stayed in the dark for 30 years was symptomatic of some kind of diffidence triggered among Americans. And then when she was recovered, she was used in a way that made a white connection clearer than the others. But it's interesting that, so because she does not bear any symbols connecting her to this America or to another America, she's probably going to survive forever, just like Egyptian monuments, because she does not have anything really connecting her to some political movement. Yes, she has a Declaration of Independence that from far away could be the Bible for all we know. I mean, but there is no flag, there is no eagle, there is, but it's interesting that Bartholdi at the beginning, when he saw her, he said, this statue is not complete. We need to apply some bas reliefs around the pedestal to illustrate some of the key moments of American history after the independence. And then he thought of transforming the whole island into a site for the burial of great Americans. So he thought of bringing there Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, all around the Statue of Liberty, as if it was sort of American equivalent of the French Pantheon, right? So a secular moment, a monument to American greatness, but this was not followed. And I think it was good in a sense, because it's a statue. Boehmer, the historian of art, said that the statue is empty and you can put whatever meaning you want. I don't think this is true. I think the statue is abstract and it's different. So abstractness, I think, will protect her from attacks, but it's a very controversial icon anyway, unless we interpret her as she was meant to be interpreted, to be interpreted. Like the icon of America, opening her arms to the whole world so that we all become a Kraussian community of love, which is what Emma Lazarus wrote, basically. But even Emma Lazarus's verses were interpreted in terms of identity, like the statue.
Jeff, thank you. Jeff Isaac is next. Jeff, make sure to unmute yourself. Jeff, can you hear us? Okay. Jeff? Well, as Jeff is trying to to get in touch. Jaime Carini. If I mispronounce the name, I apologize.
That's all right. It's Jamie Carini.
Jamie. Jamie, yes. Yeah, I know. I apologize. Yeah.
No worries. No worries. Hey, so
This is America. This is America. So we can mispronounce our names. Hi, Jamie. Yeah. And Jeff.
And I both say. Okay. So anyhow,
good to see you again. Yeah.
It's good to see you again too, virtually. Yeah, hopefully in person at some point. But yeah, no, I really, Francesca, I really enjoyed your talk today. It was really challenging on so many levels. Some of the sources that you quoted referring to racism in the US, is shocking to me, like how totalitarian in some ways those comments were. But I mean, just like painting all of Americans that way, because we know from history that not every American was racist, and some of them, like Quakers, as one example of many, like they were supporting other races, and they were on the front lines of defeating racism in America, and for helping women to get the vote. But there are other writers who I think took a different view of Americans, like Tocqueville, for instance, and he visited America. And so it seemed appropriate to ask that question, because this is a Tocqueville lecture. So what do we make of differing opinions about racism in America in light of the statue and its role and its symbolism?
Yeah. So I think it's a wonderful question. I'm not saying that all Americans are racist. I am collecting opinions circulating around the Statue of Liberty and the uses that have been made. And of course, I'm still working on this. So my book was on the history of the making of the Statue of Liberty. And the second part I'm dealing with in my classes above all, and I don't know if something else is going to come out of it, is about the contemporary uses. So I think once the statue arrives in America, she starts a completely different path. And the Kraussian meaning got changed and changed and changed. So I'm sure that there are Northern Europeans who saw the statue in a way which encompassed also Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. What I'm talking about is the way in which the statue was used on average by presidents, administrations, not the single individuals. And what I noticed is that on the one side, the same people who framed the image of the statue as this angel of welcome themselves changed their mind, because the statue becomes a way to punish America. So the minorities who identify themselves with the statue saw their own identity as opposed to society reflected in the statue, which I think is a deformation of the statue's original meaning. So the statue's soul becomes a conflicting soul, an identitarian soul. And this is the reason why women and gays and lesbians use the statue to protest against the statue, against the state, against America, against institutions. And so the statue became a conflictual icon. And of course, on the other hand, you have people using it to depict a white America and discriminate among various forms of immigration. What is certain is that this polemical use of the statue made her survive in a situation in which her abstractness was running against her assimilation by Americans. An abstract icon is impossible to transform into national icon. So this way, by using her in polemics with something, she survived, but she also brought out false ideas of America, general ideas of America. So the idea that America is a melting pot is, too general. But the fact that I registered this interpretation in connection with the statue does not imply that this is my judgment of what Americans are, because I'm not,
Yeah, of course. And I realized that my question was anachronistic too, because obviously Tocqueville was centuries before this whole conversation. But yeah, it's really fascinating how
Actually, Jamie, Laboulaye was Francesca can correct me, Laboulaye was an admirer, and I would say perhaps a disciple of Tocqueville. He wrote on Tocqueville in his early 1860s writings, and he admired Tocqueville. Tocqueville knew him, but Tocqueville was a difficult man. He didn't warm up to Laboulaye too much, from what I know. But it's interesting that he does build upon, he sees himself as building upon Tocqueville's description of America, which is surprising maybe, but not too much at the end. I don't know whether you want to add anything, Francesca, to this. We have Professor Noah Eberschmidt next, so it's up to you.
So I think that you know, he had a more optimistic view of America. He was not afraid of you know, mass despotism because he believed. So his religiosity and mysticism were way more pronounced, in my view. I don't know what you think about it. And so he had this idea, like Balanche, that the God of Christians protected Americans. His pessimism regarding what Dubois would call the color line is striking, though. So he, you know, he had this idea that the blacks would better be brought to Africa, but there Liberia would become the American pole in Africa, in the other continent. So he had this dark aspect, which explains why the chains are no longer visible. But yes, of course, they were in line on many things.
Good, thank you, Noah.
Yeah, fantastic talk, and it sort of jogged something, put something in my head I don't think I ever really quite realized. The kind of profound influence that there seems to be on the aesthetic design of the statue with ancient Mediterranean depictions of the goddess Isis. And I'm wondering if you come across in your research, if you've come across any kind of hint that in the design there was an awareness of the kind of social aspects around the cult of Isis, because Isis spreads throughout the Mediterranean world among migrant communities and immigrant communities under the Roman Empire. And so, I mean, these are thousands of years apart, but I'm wondering if there's any kind of direct influence there.
Yes, and I think the mediation, so artists in the 19th century, like Bartholdi, had this idea of creating a god that could bring all other gods together. So like a synthetic god. This was very widespread among Fourierists and Saint-Simonians in particular. But the idea of Isis is filtered, I think, through Christianity, and she becomes a Stella Maris. So we know that Isis is absorbed by the Christian Madonna of the sea, the Stella Maris. Sometimes is painted in black, and there are many occasions during the advertising of the statue in which she is described as a Stella Maris, as the consoler and helpers of mariners. Or sailors. And remember also that the statue is a light in the black, so is a North Star, which is another embodiment of Isis. And so in the same way in which she's the Madonna of sailors, the Stella Maris, she's also Isis. And it's possible that Emma Lazarus too, when she had this idea of dedicating New Colossus to the statue, had these charitable religious aspects of the Madonna or Isis in mind. Certainly the Kraussian ideal also drew on this Isiac mythology.
Thank you. The queue is open. We won't have to stay until the end if there are no further questions. But I'd like to add a few more comments that I find fascinating about this this thing. It has to do with the relationship between France and America, Francesca, which has always been fascinating to me. France has been, to my knowledge, the country that has never been at war with America. And the contribution that the French thinkers have made to the understanding of America have been significant. And I want to ask whether there's anything that you think predisposed the French to understand America perhaps better than others, or better than even the Americans were able to do so? Why is it that the greatest symbol of American democracy came from France, was a gift from France, and concocted by a disciple of Tocqueville, the person who arguably wrote one of the best books still on American democracy? Is there something about the affinity of the French towards America, which is so misunderstood today, or even by the French?
It is difficult to say. There is certainly a geopolitical allegiance against Britain. I mean, there is a traditional fear of having the British dominate the Atlantic. There is also, I think, I think, and this is why the statue has this Kraussian harmonic meaning. The elites in the 19th century were shaped by people like Lafayette and Washington. So these elites thought that the American Revolution would enlighten the world, and they continued to believe that revolutions were meant to speak to the world at large. And so the French Revolution too was made for the whole world. And then Italians thought that the example was meant for the whole world, and then the Germans as well. So I think the language of the 19th century was shaped by these two revolutions, in the sense that they shaped the way in which elite thought in universal and global terms. But I might be wrong. But from my side, from the perspective, the little perspective of my story, I certainly got this idea of creating a world, a global audience that was above single nations. And then when the statue was finished, this world was disintegrating. There was none of that anymore. And that was the unluck, and at the same time, the luck of the statue.
There's one question that Daniel Gordon from University of Massachusetts Amherst asked in the chat. He had to leave at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to take the liberty to read it. And he wrote this: isn't the American understanding of the statue determined by the Emma Lazarus poem? I don't think we are accustomed to interpreting the symbols of the statue per se. By the way, Twain missed the boat. The statue does not represent an immigrant. It represents America greeting immigrants, correct?
The statue does not represent an immigrant. It represents America greeting immigrants, correct? Well,
that's Daniel's question. So yeah.
Yeah, I think no, Twain thought that America was liberty, and he thought that this liberty was not the beggar is imagined it should be. So, not an old European woman asking for charity in America, but a haughty one saying to everybody to go away. That was his fear. And in some way, he was not completely wrong. But Emma Lazarus' poem, as I said, was a very dated poem, which then minorities interpreted in an identitarian way, but that was not the meaning given to it by Emma Lazarus, in my view. In my view, Emma Lazarus, she was thinking of Moses restoring, this universalistic, Emma Lazarus was a Jewish woman, and she quoted Renan. Renan was a source, and, Renan was quite racist himself, but he had these universalist ideas that, Jewish religion could guide the world if only divided by the Kabbalah and what he calls superstitions. And so this universalism was another way of presenting Krauser, just from the Jewish perspective. So Emma Lazarus' poem is like the Statue of Liberty. Emma Lazarus is interpreted and reinterpreted according to time and circumstances. Yes, it's true. Emma Lazarus is giving the imprint to the statue, but it's Emma Lazarus of the 20th century, not the Emma Lazarus of the 19th century, in my view.
Yeah, thank you. We are approaching the end of our time. I just want, since I don't see anyone raising their hand, I want to invite one final round of questions, if you have any. If not, I would like to say that I particularly am grateful, Francesca, for a really rich and illuminating conversation. Not many people know about the Statue of Liberty, including myself. And
I will do my best to fill up these gaps.
Yeah, and I have to say that the book itself, which is quite thick, it has how many pages? 600 pages?
I don't know, too many. I'm sorry.
Too many pages, but it's a book that I recommend to all of you. Sentinel, The Unlikely Origin of the Statue of Liberty. It's written with I think with the style of a detective novel. You want to read the next chapter. There are short chapters. That's the key to writing well, writing good and short chapters. I'm very grateful for you taking time. I'd like to invite anyone who wants to stay after we officially end to stay connected. I'd like Francesca to spend a few more minutes. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your work, but officially, I think we will cut off at 1:15. I'd like to thank you for taking time to be with us in this beautiful day. What a better time than to rethink today, not only today, but in our time, about what the symbols of America are, as we struggle with the new wave of, I wouldn't say contestation of the identity of America, but redefinition of what America stands for. And I think this is a good time to think about these topics. The serious idea of America will be continue next semester, when we'll invite speakers to discuss the importance of James Madison, the idea of fraternity in America, and a few other topics. We will announce them on the Tocqueville lecture series website at the Ostrom workshop. I'd like to invite you to our talk next week if you are interested. Our speaker will be Professor Ryan Henley from Boston College. We'll make a shift back into the 17th century. He'll be talking about the political philosophy of Fénelon, a thinker that has not received enough attention, in my view, a contemporary of the Louis XIV. Until then, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Have a safe day and enjoy the rest of your weekend. And Francesca and whoever wants to stay a bit more connected, you are welcome. A round of applause for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So you can disconnect yourself, and we can spend a few more minutes maybe. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful day here in Bloomington.
Yeah, I can see.
Oh my goodness! And I have another meeting at 2 o'clock. Actually, I have to forego one. But I thought you would be in Boston this year. So what is your what do you?
So I escaped first in Norway, because my husband is Norwegian, and so we had a very pleasant lockdown there. Yes. But then my in-laws were there, so we had to run away from there as well. And we
yeah, but those are Norwegian in-laws, so I hope less intrusive than Italian ones.
You understand the situation perfectly, because now we are in a full lockdown in Italy, where my mother is.
Okay, that's what I wanted to ask.
Worse. Yeah. But so we are staying. We are both teaching